big news coming out of the Olympics was that Ray Gunn had retired, who's the Australian breakdancer. Breakdancing in the Olympics, what's your thoughts on that?
A loss to the sport, Reagan retiring, mate. I don't know. It was the interesting thing that happened, and I think I saw it this games, right, was the nature of viewing sport has become like unbundled. So it used to be completely controlled by a single linear pipe of a feed, right? So the major sports took up the most of the sort of cultural conversation: swimming, athletics, etc. The fascinating thing that happened at Paris 2024 was that random sports took up just as much of the airtime, like for random moments. Women's rugby was huge, Reagan, whatever. These things like took up so much, and actually they were really compelling entertainment. The question is, how far do you want to go from like what people consider the traditional Olympics? In my opinion, I'm not quite sure breakdancing like fits that criteria, but to be fair, like the Olympics always tries this and sees what sits. I think people would have said surfing didn't fit that criteria, but now I think there would be no argument against surfing being in the Olympics, provided they can get good waves, right? So I think it's worth a try. But I don't think necessarily Reagan was embodied the Olympic ideal of being at the pinnacle of their sport.
Yeah, I mean, it was a sad story to an element where the reason she's retired is because of the scrutiny that she faced and the backlash, which I then find thinking, does Reagan get put into the bracket of your Eric the Eels, Eddie the Eagles, and then thinking what would have happened to those guys should they have been existing right now with the blow up of social media, the amount of insight that people probably would have just or the scrutiny that would have been added onto them. It's interesting to think of maybe what they didn't receive compared to what she has received.
That's an interesting point, yeah, because in the social media world, when you think of those guys, you think of it very positively, don't you? And you go, charming character who wasn't good at the sport, but we all loved them. And that's probably no different than the Reagan example. Although I'm sure I read somewhere like wasn't there some weird like manoeuvring that she pulled as like the head of the federation or something in order to qualify for the games. There was some like odd potential extra layer of sort of like sinister activity to this, which led to her being in the games. I think there was something like where she was able to modify the rules of qualification in her national sense to be at the games, which meant that she was due to be there even if she wasn't the best representative of her country or something. I don't know. I'm not educated fully on the nuances of the Reagan qualification process to Paris 2024. But it's a very good point, eh? Like, why could we look back on these really fun characters that were charmingly bad at their event, and it's been a net positive for their lives, actually, the fact that they weren't good, but it's turned the other way, Reagan. It's quite nasty in some ways, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, again, I wonder whether Eddie the Eagle had a net positive effect on ski jumping for just eyes on the sport. And I wonder if she has had a net positive effect on breakdancing, or whether, again, and I don't know where I sit with this. Maybe I don't believe breakdancing should be in the Olympics because it's a subjective event, and what makes a good breakdancer, I wouldn't know. Whereas, for example, if I know if I watch a gymnast, if I watch a diver, which is still subjective through judgment, I do know what is a good dive effectively. I mean, other than just saying like, oh, there was a small splash than there being a big one. But you kind of know when a gymnast has either like messed up a routine and you think, oh, there might be points deducted. But breakdancing dance is interpretive, essentially, isn't it? It's like what makes a good dancer. But ski jumping, very objective, who goes furthest. So I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that, but it's sort of where I don't know how the lay of the land will be on sports like that.
Well, when it's maybe you were tangential here, but like it's an interesting point you raised. Like, can an Olympic sport be subjective? Does that fit the Olympic ideals? And the examples you pointed out are probably technically speaking are no different than breakdancing in terms of like assessing the physical, technical capability in scoring it. I used to be of the opinion that yes, if it's subjective, it shouldn't be in the Olympics. But to be honest, I've got no evidence for that, right? Like that's just my own opinion because I existed in a sport that was the most objective, most objective possible, right? Win or don't win in athletics. But you know, I don't think it's different. The only thing I would say is like, if they were going to add breakdowns in the Olympics, they probably should have done it in 1984. You know, when it was like a pop culture phenomena on the rise. 2024 is a little bit late for breakdancing, right? You know what I mean? Like, it just shows like the slow moving beast of the IOC. It's like, oh yeah, this cultural phenomena from the breakout of hip hop will get in 40 years time. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like it's a little bit behind the time. So that's probably the main mistake they can make. I think there's lots of nuances to like the sports and the subjectiveness versus objectiveness and how Olympic is it or otherwise. But I do like the fact that the Olympic Games tries new sports, but then I also find it sad that, you know, very obvious sports that people think of the Olympic Games, like squash, for example, you know, on there. So it's you know, it's a real challenge. And some sports are in the games that arguably don't need the games to exist. Their economy is much bigger outside of the games. I always think that's quite a nice framework. Like the Olympic Games feels like the pinnacle of something, and if your sport is in that, it should be its pinnacle. And when you get, you know, I guess like the soccer competition, the football competition, or, you know, some of the golf, for example, when the Olympics is a side effect to their careers, that feels a shame to me, you know, which just, yeah, a bit different, really. Yeah.
I think tennis the same. I think when a sport like that has its four majors that sit outside of the sport, I'm not sure tennis and golf should really be in the Olympics, because it is soaking up, one, airtime, two, some form of monetary gain within there somewhere that's being hammered. But I guess the argument would be that if you've got some of the world's best tennis players, the world's best golfers, then it's bringing more eyes to the Olympics. So you see that, and does that then have, again, a bigger net gain for all the other athletes that are competing in the athletic events and track and field, anything, right? Does it draw more names to it? But also, like you said, it's got its biggest eyes are outside of the Olympics. Essentially, it's already got its own audience. It's already out there. So yeah, I don't believe they should be there.
If I should question myself on that really as well, because like it's not the Olympics' job to be an incubator for a sport to get bigger than it, right? You know, they don't need to. It doesn't need to like say, I'm not going to put this great, amazing sport on with the best talent in the world just because they already can make a good living elsewhere. You know, that it's just funny because I think traditionally, let's say from a very traditional perspective, you think of the Olympics and you can mostly to the two or three blue ribbon sports in athletics, swimming, gymnastics, etc. And it is absolutely the pinnacle of your career in those sports to win Olympic gold. Like almost the other accolades almost don't matter. Tennis is an interesting one though, because I think they found a middle ground. The biggest stars seem to value their Olympic gold just as much, or close to as much, as the majors. They definitely don't get paid as well for it. Well, they don't get paid, but directly anyway. But they have found a nice middle ground, and I've been pleased to see, you know, the biggest names in tennis have cared a lot about winning Olympic gold over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, which perhaps they didn't always do so. When, you know, the question is like, would you put Formula One in the Olympics? You know, like it feels like it would be very much like a really minor competition for them. Does anyone remember who won Olympic gold in the under-23 football? You know, it doesn't register. Whereas like in tennis, it feels like Olympic gold still registers in a player's career. So I almost just want the Olympics to matter. I care about it. I think it's really fun and it's all I've ever known. So I kind of, you know, if the sports are going to be in it, I want it to matter to those sports basically.
Well, I think on the tennis and golf side, they're both sports where they never have a team moment other than playing doubles in the Davis Cup in tennis. But then you see with the Davis Cup that the players really get behind it, right? They're so behind playing for their countries that's like the one time where they know that the majority of their fans are probably united behind them because it's their countrymen, and that might play into it. Whereas the rest of the time when they're playing in all of the majors and the Grand Slams, that they will probably have fans from multiple different nations, and it's just their fan base, sort of their Instagram account base, do you know what I mean? Their followers that generally are multicultural and multinational, but then in this one event, it's galvanized into being
you get
every one of your nation.
Patriotism behind it.
100%.
That must be quite nice, a feeling when you come from a sport which doesn't have any dynamic around that, right? And it's all about just you as an individual, as a personality, and how popular or talented you are, and then you can somehow sort of align behind this sort of common mission or group of you. It must be quite nice as the individual there to be able to do that. So listen, I think there's a balance, and the truth is there's no clear answer to this, right? Of course there's not. The Olympics is a made up concept. It's an arbitrary group of things which somebody at some point decided to group together, and it should always evolve, and that's probably its strength. The challenge is, does it evolve quick enough? As I said, bringing breakdancing in 40 years after its advent is probably, an example of how not to do things. And it probably needs to be a little bit, leaner and a little bit faster and more agile, which I feel like the IOC has realized now, in its whole commercial model and its bidding model, etc. Whether it's, can act quick enough to sort of execute on this required agility will be interesting to see in the next sort of few Olympiads.
Yeah, do you think there needs to be a clearer definition of what actually makes an Olympic sport?
That's a hard question, is it? My instinctive answer is yes, but I don't know what the answer is. Like, I don't know what the granular detail is behind that. Okay, the faster, stronger, whatever, all these sort of superlatives. I do think we should be, it should have a physical nature to it. Like that to me feels like something. And then that draws into a question, well, how physical is archery?
Yeah, is shooting, darts, where does that sit in there?
Yeah, exactly. That feels to me like a game as opposed to a sport, But this is just a random line in the sand that you can make myriad arguments against and for. So there's no easy answer, and I guess they'll probably just put whatever gets them more views and more success of the product in there.
Yeah, and then you look at whether you're talking about human performance and does equestrian sit within there, right? So it's and pentathlon, where do those sit within it? And that's why I've always I found this sort of last 12 years in the Olympics where they've started to broaden the horizons of what sports could be in there. Cricket's on the agenda in LA, right? And I'm as a cricketer, I don't get it. I just don't.
Interesting.
Again, it's still got an element of it. We have our sport outside. So cricket's the second largest sport in the world. It's doing okay on a global scale. Why do we need to bring in an Olympic medal into that? I'm just, again, my only thinking can be that it's down to, let's bring an audience into the Olympics. And is that then down to sort of the tracked on question to that? Is it that the Olympics was suffering from being just what it was? So it's having to bring in these sports.
But I think it's always had to do that, right? And you're right. It is, the movement for sure was suffering, and probably still is to an extent. And if you have to think about it in each game's perspective, don't you? I think because cricket makes a lot of sense in LA, because the growing need and desire for cricket in the US, the one market which cricket, could really do with cracking. So it's like a two-way street. Probably helps the games, but it also helps cricket. So, I'm not against that. I mean, cricket is very hard work. It's like I think it's got absolutely place. What form of the game are they going to play in the?
It's definitely going to be a one-day format. So it's either going to be 2020 or one day, but I don't know, and I actually don't know if it's just women at first. So I actually think it might just be women. I could be getting that massively wrong. I mean, fair if it is just women.
There's two ways. Like the Olympics obviously sees itself as kind of like it has a duty in some way to help foster sports or help them grow and play and use its role. Like being associated with the Olympics makes a smaller sport get bigger, eyeballs on them, etc. But then also the Olympics needs to be successful in and of itself. So it needs to choose those carefully, which it thinks are going to feed the main property and the main entity directly. So, I mean, ultimately it probably all comes down to the incentives of making the Olympics more successful, and then being able to paint it as we're also helping this sport grow and fostering that sport. Whatever happens, if the Olympics continues to inspire people to sort of be active, or it even goes down to sport in a sort of deeper sense, right? Like, is, why do we care about sport? Why does it matter, like, seeing people do good sporting performances? And I think there's something around, like, what it takes to perform well at a high level is kind of like the ideals we want society to care about. There's hard work and discipline and team, like team spirit and sportsmanship, and and then seeing someone get their reward for hard work, etc. So, like, the Olympics, probably, as long as it continues to do that, and if it has a net positive effect on even people's psyche to say, that's cool, I didn't think about playing that, I'm going to go play that, or like, that's inspired me to go out for a run or whatever, like, then so what? You know what I mean? The question is, if it was darts, does it inspire someone to, like, be healthier? And I don't know. That's where the line might
That's a really good point.
Yeah,
that's a really good point. Does the total audience and sort of the culture of the games create a culture that it should stand for, almost on a legacy point of view, from a wider societal point of view? Because it's interesting that you then a environment like the Olympics, athletics, just high performance sport like that, is ultimately trying to promote an incredibly healthy lifestyle and well-being for all people, but actually there is so much evidence and reports on how unhealthy it is to be a high performance athlete.
At the top, yeah, the irony, yeah.
Right? How ironic that the people that everyone is looking to for all of this advice on how do I become healthy, how do I be fit, well, and be one of the top, that actually when you're at the top, it's unhealthy. I remember listening to a podcast on a mitochondrial expert, but had worked for one of the Tour de France teams, right?
Yeah.
And essentially, everyone would look at the Tour de France and be like, these guys are the elitist of the elite. These are the best athletes. And he was talking into some of the data. He essentially said, like, for every Tour de France that these guys are doing, they're essentially knocking a year off their life.
Yeah.
So
it causes such oxidative stress at a sort of cellular level that you effectively age yourself by performing this.
Yeah, and that the density of their bone, of their bone mass was similar to that of someone in their 80s by the end of each race, because of just all of their fuel systems were just pulling on any cell in their body to just try and get them over the line and through the race. And it's like, how is that healthy?
Yeah,
it's literally not.
Yeah, it's almost like being sort of lab rats or guinea pigs in this thing, right? So, like, we discover what the health metrics are as a result of people pushing it too far. But I mean, it's so right. I mean, sometimes I look at the wrinkles on my face and think, hold on a second, I think I pushed myself too hard sometimes when I was training. But, like, yeah, maybe you have to have this subset of people that take it to the absolute extreme in order to learn what normal is. But it is like a kind of cliff edge, is that you're climbing up this hill and it's getting more positive, and then it can very quickly just fall off into, like, okay, that went too far, But at the end of the day, it's also exciting to watch. So, like, it doesn't need also to be done, and it's something in human nature to see people performing this, or like, I always put it this way, like, it's very odd, the concept of sport. Like, really, if you were describing to an alien race, like, oh yeah, we do this thing called sport, and they didn't know what it was, like, well, so people do really weird niche physical activities, and they become really good at these really niche things, and then we go, wow, you're so good, and we want to reward you for being really good at that very niche thing. And I love watching you do that. And it's just like it's a really odd thing to actually do. But in the end of the day, like, there's something inbuilt in us, like, and I'm sure there's some evolutionary theory behind it. But, like, in watching these performances, if you go to something as odd as, like, high jump in athletics, it's not healthy to be a good high jumper at all. A lot of elite high jumpers, people don't realize, they smoke loads of cigarettes because it takes their appetite away, and they don't need to use their lungs, right? So they're like heavy smokers at the top end. Like, I've seen world class, like, world champion level high jumpers in the warm up area of the track, having a fag, and then going to competing. And it's like completely opposite to, like, the ideals you hold sport up for, right? But you almost need this, like, sharp end of the spectrum to then figure out what the happy medium is that we should all be aiming for, maybe.
Yeah, I listened to Joe Marler recently, came on the High Performance podcast, I think, but it was an interview with Joe Marler talking about his recent retirement from rugby. And one of the elements that he spoke about is obviously rugby's got huge risks with concussion, and there's massive psychological consequences that are being spoken about, going to CTE, all sorts. But there was a really kind of nice moment where he just said, but you have to accept that's what you're signing up for. Do you think athletics, Olympic sports, definitely track and field, because that's your field, do you think that enough athletes really recognize what they're signing up for, or do you think it actually shocks them more when they do get to that part going, oh wow, this is actually what it's going to take, or this is what my life now is?
Well, in my case, I didn't realize. But, most things in life you don't realise. You sort of find yourself on a certain path and you kind of incrementally progress, and that becomes your norm. And I always find this this is an interesting point, like you get a lot of retired sports people that hope to make a career out of kind of motivational speaking, especially to businesses. They go, it's a good pathway, and they tend to be good storytellers and have really good stories to tell. But the thing that I always find quite cringe is they often go like, I had to dedicate and sacrifice so much for my sport, and these are the lessons you should all learn from my sacrifice. The truth is, in 95% of the cases, none of us knew any different, because you did it from so young that it was just your reality. So I had no frame of reference other than like doing extremely hard physical activity many times a week since I was 8 years old. And so I didn't know what normal life was. I wasn't sacrificing anything. That was all I'd ever done. And to be honest, it was all I ever cared about, because I was blinkered. That's what I'd done. And people referred to me as that. So like, you often get this kind of athletes go to these talks with this kind of holier than thou. See, I know how to dedicate myself, and I'm disciplined, and you guys aren't. You should learn from me. You're not disciplined. You've never had any change. It's like if you grew up in a single room house. It's not like you've chosen to downgrade, like you just, that's all you've ever known. So like, it's not like at some point I was like 16 and someone goes, right, you can not do sport or you can do sport, but here's all the downside and here's the things that come with it. You just kind of, like with most things in life, you kind of just follow the path of least or medium resistance and think, oh, that's cool, that's not cool, I'll do that. And then before you know it, you're in so deep. Like, every day I'm killing myself on the track and I'm vomiting from effort, but I don't know any different. I didn't have any other choice, right? So I think it's probably often talked about in too much hyperbole. And the reality is, you kind of like, no matter what role you fall into in life, whether it's sport or in something, a lot of the times it wasn't through a conscious decision. It was just through like following the obvious next step. So I do, when you look back at it and you join the dots looking backwards, which is a Steve Jobs quote, yes, I realised that's what I was signing up for, but only now, once you've done it, you can go back, well, of course it was going to be hard, and of course I was going to have to take all these setbacks and downsides, and I do think, the sort of mental health and especially the concussion stuff is a very interesting dynamic, and be interesting to see how that pans out over the coming years.
The motivational speaking thing is really interesting, because I've done a bit of speaking myself and it's a part of what I do, and I've always cringed at that sort of part of it where you say, yes, I had to sacrifice it, and you're totally right, you were just in one mind. And when everyone says, what did it feel like, and I go, well, honestly, what does your life feel like? I don't know what else to feel, right? It's just the thing that I was in. And ultimately you are kind of, I felt that I felt wrong to be offering advice on how to be disciplined, committed, and things like that, when I was only siloed in a certain few activities, which was like, I know how to be disciplined really well at going to the gym, at getting training, like being really good on my diet, all of those sorts of things, which are ultimately good traits to have. But the transferable skill to take it to, say, like a corporate environment, I have now really had to learn. And the discipline and hard work that it takes to grow your business, to do the work that is not sport related, is totally different. It is not the same thing. And you, as someone who has been in the corporate world, you've built businesses, how have you found that? Did you find that it is a completely different system that you're pulling on, or did you transfer it over? Did you find you could do it easily?
So I think there is very clear transferable stuff, but it's actually not where you think it is, right? So, in my experience, right? So when I retired from the sport, and I'd already sort of dovetailed this startup DNA Fit, co-founding this startup before I kind of finished the sport. So I never had time to take stock and think, what am I going to do next? Just as I mentioned before, you kind of just follow these paths, right? And before you know it, you're down one. and so, but after I'd had actually my first sort of exit. So after we built this business and 5 years later we sold it, I kind of had a little bit of time to take stock and think, whoa, 5 years ago I was an athlete and I was in this position, and now I've sold this business, millions of quid, and it's sort of like you take this sort of different view of things. And I remember at that point realizing, like, the reason I was good at this corporate stuff, at this like non-sport life, was absolutely because of my sport life, but it wasn't from the clear things of like discipline and and there was something about handling pressure. I think there's a big factor in like resilience. And one of my key sort of theses around like why sports people make good entrepreneurs and should embrace that more is this: in sport, it is basically nothing but failure, and then punctuated by occasional success, right? Good session, great. Most sessions are not great, but you do it anyway. Lose a match, lose a race, and then you don't go, oh, I'm out of sport then. Like, I'm not going to try that again. You go, okay, let's train more. And that's something which, when you haven't gone through a sporting background, even if it was just recreational or amateur, it's very hard to learn from a non-sport environment, right? Like, not getting a job doesn't mean, right, okay, now I'm just going to, I'm going to keep trying for that same job, right? Like, it doesn't, you often tend to like move away or tangentially like change course in a non-sporting life. So I think that resilience thing is true, but the whole sort of self-discipline and stuff, like, it was the softer skills that I find like I carried from sport into business life that were more effective than the hard stuff, the harder, like, more tangible skills. So, the ability to perform, and when I say perform, you could talk about this in entertainment or acting as well. And that means when you're not entirely sure of yourself, like, it might not be your realm of expertise, and you're happy to walk into an important meeting or a room of people and tell them a story that ultimately ends up in them sort of purchasing something or buying something or coming along on a journey with you. I think sport gives you a lot of that, right? You don't know if you're going to perform well when you go out on the pitch or on the track. Even if you've done loads of training, you're just like hoping you pull it off. And there's a kind of like, performance to that, which is more than just the physical ability. And that's like that cognitive ability to just go out there and put it all out, and hopefully it works out. And that, I think, is a really powerful skill in the corporate side. So whenever I see, to your point, right, speaking to businesses, the best thing sports people can do if they're speaking to businesses is talk about these sort of things, right? Being really scared about things and doing them anyway, trying to sort of make the most of like failure to go to the next thing, rather than saying you should all be really disciplined, because discipline is intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic, right? And you can't just decide to be disciplined one day. It has to be as a result of sort of other factors that you're taking in your life. So I do agree there was very clear transferables, but I think they come from like almost like a different layer of those skills than people sort of have written about or have charged businesses money for motivational speaking based on in the past.
One I'd add in there, I reckon, is performing when you're not 100%, because sport, you are constantly never at 100%. So there's always
Did you
something.
ever feel like you were performing 100%? I never, ever felt great on race day.
Do you know, really interestingly, I had this conversation and I actually said the days when I felt 100% were usually the day I got injured, and I then started to have warning signs when I actually felt 100%. I almost wanted to go out onto the field and be like, geez, my ankle feels horrible, or my right glute is just feeling slightly off. And I just needed something to almost wake me up from this trance. When I felt 100%, I would guess arguably you probably overextend, and then that's actually why you cause an injury, right? But it was so weird that the days where I felt the most comfortable in my body, I would be sitting there going, oh my God, I don't know. I had warning signs. There were days where if I had, say, like a great night's sleep and I felt probably cognitively aware, but my body felt off, that was slightly different. I think being mentally tuned in and being mentally ready, like that can be a thing. but the whole transferable of an athlete to business, I think the opportunity grab to be someone who is resilient and able to perform when you're not at 100% is a huge land grab opportunity in the outer world now, when there's so many people, I think, that are really easy to glorify sort of the minor inconvenience in their life, which then allows them to take the easy option. And that, again, is probably a societal thing where we've given people too many easy options and easy outs. But what an opportunity for someone in sport to go, do you know what? If I am just feeling a little bit run down, maybe I had a few hours sleep because the kids kept me up last night, I can still get on with it because I've had tough days before. Like, I'll find a way to perform.
You know what? You're really good insight, and I completely agree. And if I think back to this, like, I got used to accepting that I was going to feel awful, horrendous, have terrible preparation for every major thing that mattered to me in sport. You know, like when I ran at the Olympic Games and I ran my best, and this is probably the case for every single great performance you've ever seen, right, in sport. No doubt that person had an awful night's sleep, was feeling a twinge, wasn't right. Something was, they were having an argument with their spouse or something offline beforehand. Like, nothing ever goes well. And I know this because I've worked with other people who've won Olympic golds, and you know, and I've been close to them, and I know these stories. And actually, it's always the case. And if ever, there was probably a small handful of competitions I've done in my life where I felt great, and they were never my best competitions. Like, never. You know, even looking at it in world records are generally run in athletics in the major championships, and they shouldn't be run then, because in the major championships they've had to do qualifying rounds and media commitments, and they should be running one-off meets, and they do happen sometimes, but generally speaking you see these world records, these life-changing performances at the end of 3 qualification rounds back to back, with lots of other stuff going on, with less than ideal sleep because they're staying in the Olympic Village where everyone's, you know, milling around and they've got cardboard beds or whatever they had, right? And so that's a really good point. And if I ever do any talks to businesses, I'm going to steal that from you, Lisk, and say, like, this is exactly it. When you show up in normal life, if you haven't been through that kind of sporting background, it's very easy to think that, like, hold on, this inconvenience or this problem is a reason for me to put this off or postpone this or change tact. And that actually feeds into, like, a lot of the work I do with startups. There's a very famous sort of trope in startups, is you usually launch too early. A lot of businesses fail because they're trying to be too perfect before they actually get out there and actually figure out what customers care about or not, and get the negative feedback and speak to the user, etc. And that's the same thing. Be willing to fail, be willing to take that risk, and be okay, be comfortable with uncomfortable, like, conditions for your launch. So yeah, good insight, mate, and I completely agree.
Well, the thing that also sings to me a little bit with this topic was the 100-meter final, or the 200-meter final with Noah Lyles.
Yeah,
and I think that was the race where he had COVID, and I found that really interesting because he got wheeled away in a wheelchair after, but literally a minute earlier was coming out doing backflips.
It's ridiculous jump, and he broke some starting blocks or something. He threw them on the ground or something.
Do you know what I mean? And
yeah.
I looked at it and I went, okay, there's a couple of things happening here. He is either trying to have some huge psychological advantage over everyone there to just be like, I am Noah Lyles, I'm about to come in and take my crown, or he's either trying to, like, kid himself as well, and create that, like, and create that energy that he feels he needs to, because he's lacking it. And then I think it was Michael Johnson who sort of commentated on it after, where if you're using it as an excuse, it's you're already in the arena. Like, there's almost no reason to have the excuse. If it really was that debilitating, like, why have you gone out that far? Have you done that? If he'd sort of come out and walked quietly to the blocks, maybe had, like, a quiet confidence about him, you might even have looked at it and gone, oh, he's a bit different here. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah,
and then that would have kept you and it would have kept you underneath the radar. But it also, from a psychological point, could have had the similar effect. Go, oh, I expected Noah Lyles to come out here and be all over the place and be beating his chest, and he's not. Wow, what's up? And that could have put an element of doubt in the other sprinters. So
yeah, it's interesting. I think you're probably right. I would imagine he was probably overcompensating to himself right, for how he felt. He was probably very nervous, very aware of the fact he was not feeling good, and he was trying to sort of, just get everything out of himself, and he probably didn't do himself any favors. The wheelchair is probably a little bit of melodrama afterwards.
The argument honest. As well was he was expending energy just doing all of that. If you've got COVID, you don't want to be breathing too much. You don't want to be use it all in the 200 meters, and then
well, there's lots of factors to Noah and his all the surrounding sort of show that you could talk about all the time, and arguably that's what he wants, So, but the other side is, what do you want him to do before the race? Call a press conference, say, by the way, guys, I'm not feeling that well, but I'm still going to run. That also doesn't make sense either, right? But I think probably some humility would have been appreciated. But at the end of the day, he also could have pulled it off, and then it wouldn't matter, and you wouldn't even be talking about it, So that's the razor that you choose to tread when you're a sportsman. Sometimes you pull it off, don't you? Yeah.
Have you watched Sprint?
I've watched the first season, not the second. Which is it out yet? I think it's just
it is out. Yeah. I haven't watched it either. Yeah. What did you think of the first one?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, it was interesting. I mean, to be honest, a little bit different for me, knowing the characters sort of personally and knowing the environment and the economy and stuff. And I could see some of it absolutely was definitely a little bit of hyperbole based off this is a documentary made. It needs to be exciting. My own take on it is someone like Noah makes this case that he says, it's my duty to be entertaining. And that to me isn't as authentic as just being entertaining, right? If you know that you have to deliberately be entertaining, you aren't entertaining in my eyes. Whereas Bolt, it was naturally who Bolt was, right? Bolt was genuinely just entertaining in who he was. And obviously the performances were entertaining, but everything around him was so authentic. If you are telling people that I am choosing to do this so I get, airtime, etc., to me, that is not that exciting, right? But that's maybe I'm being overly cynical because I'm involved in the industry,
It's like a comedian coming out and going, I'm here to be funny.
Yeah. So it's if you have to tell people that's why you're doing it, then you're not really that, you aren't actually engaging, right? So that's, whereas I feel a lot of the other stars in it are almost just as engaging without having to be hey guys, I'm being engaging. It's so that's my sort of somewhat a little bit cynical take on it. But I don't think the sport isn't short of characters, right? And if I talk about athletics, right, we're facing a challenge. The sport is short of allowing those stories to come out, right? And the sport is short of innovating to just let that story. There's incredible stories of competition that happen in field events, and they're completely lost to the viewer. And you only see them if you're sat at a certain part of the stadium. I used to for years I managed Greg Rutherford as his agent, and it was at every competition. And I, even as a sprinter, had been in and around elite competitions for 12 years. I never understood the drama of a long jump competition until I was being the coach type character on the side, right? And I wish the media somehow would figure out a way to get the stories across, because there's all sorts of weird psychological games going on, because they're all sat around doing a different jump, watching each other, the order in which they jump, the way they see how they're interacting with their coach or what they're doing in between, and pretending to clap the other one because they're supporting them, but it's fake. There's amazing stories happening here. And I think the sport needs to tease these things out more, rather than just have someone to be guys, I wear these clothes and I've got I'm big and brashy. If they're naturally that great, but if they have to put that on, then there's no point, right? That's my take on it anyway.
Do you think that's too much of sort of the commercialization of Olympic athletes now, that has now become one big opportunity for revenue, so brand deals and the ability to build your social media following, and then know that you can probably monetize that post-career as well, so your career is no longer going to be shut off the moment you hang up the spikes? Or do you feel there's also, there's maybe a draw to be one of those personalities to get more eyes on you, say on a Netflix show? Or is there a pressure that's being, put on them from somewhere to have to be like that?
I think with most people, there's a story and an authenticity to be found, even if you think they're a quiet, non-entertaining person. I think there's entertainment and story in sport, no matter what. And I think the best, true, long-term legacies come from those who do it authentically to who they actually are. right? So I would, say to if there's up and coming sports people, is like, be happy to just like completely double down on like who you actually naturally are. If you're an absolute geek and these are things you care about, like, don't be shy of that. And or if you're really quiet and really shy, that makes for an interesting story nonetheless, right? And you also don't have to be the best. You don't have to have been the gold medal winner or even the medal winner, right? There, people can have great legacies, and there's often a survivorship bias to only look at the stories of the person who won, and naturally that will take up a majority of sort of the public consciousness. But there are great people from sport that have great long lasting careers or legacies and can give insights who weren't necessarily the greatest ever, right? And often the greatest ever are kind of not that entertaining outside of their performances. So Bolt, I think Bolt's like a really unique case where he's just really engaging and sort of, even though he was absolutely the greatest there ever was. So I think there's just a balance there. What I found really interesting now, and it's bits to that point we mentioned right at the start of this podcast, was like, the unbundling of this coverage because of social media means that people who are the 7th place finisher or the semi-finalist can have great careers now because they can own their audience through social media, and they can be admired and be famous and make a living by being just one of them. But they've got a niche about how they go about that. Maybe they post really good training video content and people love to follow that for general health advice. Maybe they're really into like mental health and they make that their niche, or they own a brand on the side and they sort of do something around that, and their identity isn't entirely tied to the fact they're going to win gold or not. And I think that's really positive for sport and society in general, probably. I think it's quite an exciting sort of new era that's coming from this.
Where the comparison could either be a really great thing or a bad thing, because that comparison can either make you go, well, someone's doing something really well, then I can go and become more authentic in myself, and there's actually an opportunity for me to lean into that because I can see other people doing that. Or there's the idea that I need to be more like someone else in order to have that opportunity, and in seeking that version, you actually try to just become them, but no one can do them better than them, and so you actually don't become authentic in that.
Yeah, you sort of end up nowhere, really.
And do you know what? I've done that before, and I've always been so curious as to like how you create your authenticity and your originality. And I think it was a Dale Carnegie book that spoke about it, where essentially looked at something like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and then just deciphered old speeches sort of decades and decades past, where you could almost tease out how that speech had been written, and it essentially was an original piece and a very famous original piece, but actually there were just past speeches from, whether it's like Abraham Lincoln and people from past, that it ultimately had similar themes. And it gave this concept of like true originality and authenticity isn't like you actually have to come up with something brand new, because that's quite rare. And even now, in a highly volatile information age, there's very few original ideas coming out. But an original idea can be the culmination of many different things that you've interacted with, different things from other people, and then you do it in your own way. Guest on the podcast, a very famous cricketer, Dale Steyn, spoke about how his bowling technique, he's like an icon in the sport and one of the best ever, but his bowling technique, when he broke it down, he said, right, this part of my run-up, I believed I was Mitchell Johnson, one of his sort of nemesis from Australia. When I got midway through my technique, my run-up, I felt I was Sean Pollock, a hero of South Africa. And then the last bit of my technique, when I gathered, I imagined I was Annan Donald. He's like, you put all three of those together, you got Dale Steyn. And that for me was like, wow, I'd used to do that with my technique. I used to think of myself as different people, but actually my technique was mine and the way I did it was me. We're talking also the added stuff around your charisma, your character, around what your personality is like around. And I think you can kind of lean into that a little bit, but trying to be too much like everyone else will definitely pull you away from being yourself and reduce the opportunities that are there that exist in being as authentic and original, which it sounds obvious, but it just really is a truism.
Well, no, yeah. I mean, I think playing that back, I think what you're saying is like, originality is actually just the sum of other non-original parts being interpolated in a certain way, right? And that, I mean, you can throw it, and that's completely true. Like authentic foods. There's a really interesting there's an interesting journalist who writes about like Italy, and it's got this obsession with like, oh, that's not the authentic way to make it, but like a lot of these things, there's no such thing as authentic, right? Oh, well, actually, did pasta come from China because it was noodles? And it's like nothing is truly original. Everything is built on the previous. You can look at music, like the Beatles, that was a certain type of music, but it was just the blues, and they just stole the blues. Elvis Presley just stole the blues, and then hip hop came from this, and everything is an interpolation and an extrapolation of something that came before it, right? And if you're a young sports person and you're trying to figure out who you are, like you probably don't need to worry that maybe someone else does this type of content in the same way. The sum of the parts will be who you are. There's a really good guy, I think he's called Jordan Rogers on Instagram, and he's an ex-Nike sports marketing like VP or something, and he does like really good content around sports marketing and branding and what works and what doesn't. And there's a really good example. There's a 110 meter hurdler who's one of the best in the world in track and field, and in one of his post-race conferences after the Olympics, he said, I've not got to watch Steele even though I win everything, like bit like sort of poor me because I'm not charismatic enough. And he did this really interesting post where he sort of tore that apart and said, well, let's look at it. Is it because you're not charismatic enough, or is it because of these? You can't just like say, well, I win, so therefore I should have a deal, right? Why do brands want to work with you? And it's about who. He had these 6 tenets of this framework, and I can't remember the specifics, but he basically broke that down really well. So performance is one of them. Great, you've ticked that box, but there's 5 other boxes here that you need to tick somehow, and actually that character, for right or wrong, isn't managing to tell that story correctly. And I'm sure if he was, then he'd feel like he was being seen and being rewarded in the right way, But that's what I mean. Performance is one metric. And I really like this new world where people can have an audience that will value them. We have this almost like narrow but very deep starship. Like they can be a star, they can be famous, to a really deeply engaged but quite narrow group of people. In the past, you relied on 2 or 3 major linear funnels to be known and be famous and have a chance of making a career. The mainstream TV, the mainstream print media, etc. And that means everyone kind of knew who you were, and then there were levels of how serious a fan they were. But now you can have someone that can have 250,000 followers, ostensibly not a huge amount in the grand scheme of things, who feel that person is an A-list star to them. But then anyone who doesn't follow them haven't got a clue who they are. Like literally they could walk completely anonymously down the street unless someone happens to follow them, and so then they're like the biggest star possible. And I think that's really powerful. Sports people could leverage that for their own good, as long as they can do that in the right sort of authenticity and leverage that well.
Ilona Maher, the rugby player for the USA, she's doing that to
perfect example
degree.
Yeah.
And the thing I really like is, one, she sprinkles in rugby obviously, but it is really her that everyone has fallen in love with. And I think that is such an opportunity that many athletes miss out on. And I've had this with the podcast, is that you can get someone, and you would have seen it with After Dinner Speakers, you can get someone with an amazing story and an amazing life that they've had, but really unable to tell it well and to engage an audience and to essentially lean into that part that could unlock a completely new life for them away from the sport. Doesn't detract away from the sport for them, but it just gives them another avenue. And I think it probably strengthens their sport in some degree anyway, because they're just being themselves. I wonder if it is down to the fact that people are, and especially we're talking about elite athletes with audiences, that people are just really scared of what they say due to whether it's cancel culture, saying the wrong thing. Am I going to get judged purely on my true identity and my true original thought, and that being the thing that no one likes? And I'm always really, one of the biggest quotes in my life that resonates with me, and I try to remind myself of it as much as I possibly can, was from Jim Carrey during a film that is called Jim and Andy. Have you ever seen this film?
No.
I really recommend you watch it. It's called Jim and Andy. It's when he played Andy Kaufman on Man on the Moon, and Universal Studios hid the behind-the-scenes footage when they shot this film. They hid the footage and locked it away for 20 years because they were too worried that people would see Jim Carrey as an asshole. And so he was the biggest star of the 90s, and what he did during this film was incredible. He went into full character. Okay, so he became Andy Kaufman for the entire time that he filmed this film, and it shows all the footage of what happened during that process. It's an incredible film. But there's a line in it that he says, which is amazing. And it is that you can take a chance on being loved or hated for who you really are, or go to your grave holding on to a character that you never were. And I love that line because it is so true that I think many people are holding on to a character that they really aren't. And they aren't willing to take that chance on being themselves. And really, a timely episode is you think of Donald Trump. He is the epitome of just being this character, but you don't really know who he is. But it could really be him. I mean, actually, it's maybe not a great example because you don't actually know if that truly is him. But whatever it is, he's happy to be loved or hated for that character.
Yeah.
But Jim Carrey really, for me, was the epitome of that. He once he had this realization and this sort of come to life moment, he just, okay, I'm going to be this guy that I know I am. And if people don't like me, then that's it. I put Robin Williams into that category as well. They were sort of similar characters. But I think there's so many people that aren't willing to be themselves just through this sheer fear, like, what happens if it doesn't work out when I am really myself and I'm not liked? I've struggled with that, and I try to even tussle with that when I'm on the podcast, because I think as soon as the camera presses record, you are, okay, I've got to present myself, and I have to really force myself to go, no, just be you, Lou. Like, there's enough people that will like you and things will be okay, and those that don't, that's on them. Because
yeah,
that's
I think there's probably some sort of guardrails within that, in terms of, like, some people often use that, I'm just being me, for a reason to just be horrible and pleasant characters, right? You know what I mean?
Totally, like, not to bring disdain to the world and to
within societal norms and courtesy and, you know, being empathetic and good people. But you know, you're right, but you know, it comes to the same thing we talked about before, like not being afraid to fail. You know, like if you're. And I think in sports, you often get these really dull post-match or post-race interviews. And I found that really hard to have an opinion, because I'd literally just finished and my life had either just been made or ruined. Like, I'm physically knackered, mentally I don't know what I think. And you go, what do you think of that? And you go, and then so you reel off these kind of, like, just, you know, just like mundane, like, nonsense, like, jargon, basically. Go, well, yeah, I executed on the turn and I've not started any speed work yet. And you just talk this nonsense, which actually tells people nothing. And the best athletes are the ones where they manage to somehow, like, or sports people, the most engaging things, they manage to turn off that guardrail after an event, or they're able to tap into who they are and what they really feel and just be relaxed at that point. And it's very, very hard. You know, it's very, very hard, like, to do so. I always thought it was brilliant when, I don't know if you remember, there was which World Championships? Well, Bolt was, you know, absolutely meant to win, and he false started. I think it was maybe like Daegu 2013 or Moscow Daegu 2013, something like that. I think it was Daegu World Championships, and he false started, and of course he would have won if he'd not done the race. And afterwards, some reporter caught up to him as he was walking across, and he was genuinely, you know, furious. And he was also like, I'm not going to cry. What do you want me to cry? You know, like, and I felt that was so genuine, and it was just so great to see that. And he was able to sort of, you know, communicate the real feelings that a fan would appreciate and probably empathize with, but also still respect. You know, like be like, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, you're not there saying, well, you know, it happens. You know, don't blame me for it. He was like, yeah, it's my fault, but what do you want me to do? I'm not crying. Like, you know, I'm angry. Should have won. And I think that's really great. It's very hard to do. I remember being asked about Brexit after the national championship finals, and the vote had just happened the day before. I was like, and I just reeled off some nonsense and probably said some like stupid stuff. And I was very much against Brexit, right? You know, I still am, but I live in Lisbon, so, you know. but like, and I remember thinking, like, this is not the environment. And I called that Sean Ingle for The Guardian, a friend of mine as well, asking me about Brexit. Immediately after I just failed to make the Olympic Games in 2016, it's like, I can't give a very well informed opinion on this at the moment. You know, like, it's very hard to tap into that. But people can, if you can find that superpower to be, like, relaxed enough and confident enough in yourself to, like, speak how you would speak and not, like, just reel off these weird mundanities, then you get rewarded for that in some way, either from you really put off the people that don't like you, but you find your tribe that do like you, or you actually come across as really really positive to a lot of people, right? And that's a risk you've probably got to be willing to take.
Well, I guess even like we've mentioned, you run businesses and you've been in the business world since sport. That what we're kind of talking about is like a branding exercise for an athlete,
true.
right? So I wonder where would be a right moment to bring that type of conversation for, and it's not branding that, because obviously there will be certain people with very high profile athletes that will go, okay, this is the type of brand that you are, and we're going to build a brand around you. It's not that. It's your personality brand. It's you as a human being. It's your depth. It's your values, your persona, the person you really are. I wonder if there is not enough work done on that, because ultimately the big thing that does happen at the end of an athlete's life or their sporting life is that they have this identity crisis. They don't know who they are. So should we be implementing more in-depth conversation, genuine tangible learning and opportunities for athletes to start to look at, right, who am I? Really, who am I?
It's a really good point. And I mentioned that guy, Jordan Rogers, that I really enjoy his content on Instagram, the sports marketing exec. And it'd probably be great benefit to young athletes coming into performance environments being taught some of these frameworks, because one, they're going to find it interesting because they're going to think, hey, this is a route to me making money and having a career and being famous and having a legacy. But two, it's also going to help them, figure out how they show up in some ways, and that's probably going to help their performance. I always have been a massive sort of passion of mine is that we know now in corporate work life that, like, if you don't have a work-life balance, you probably don't do work well and you don't do life well either, right? You do neither well if you don't have a balance between that. And it's the same in sport. You need a sport-life balance. You need this balance between your normal life and your performance life. And if you can find an identity, and I was always very lucky. I always had this other identity. I was a musician, I had a music production thing going on, and I had all these other things that I was sort of really into outside of sport. And for sure, it helped me be better at sport because it meant I was able to rest. And people talk about rest in some physical sense, but you're able to rest mentally because I could finish training. I could do something else, which was not just thinking about the next session or thinking about my nerves for the competition. So, like, I do think you're probably right. Amazing if you could come into a sporting environment as a young person and be given a framework to think about brand. The best businesses speak very specifically to what we call the one type of customer persona, or ICP, ideal customer persona, right? And this is something you do, and it's tempting to think you can speak to everyone. I've got these products and they could be used by really high level athletes, they could be used by beginners, they could be used by people halfway down their health journey. If you try and reach them all, like, it's surefire. As an investor, if you see a business and you say, who are your customers? Say, well, everyone really. Like, they're not really going to nail it, right? They're not going to succeed. You have to choose one, and businesses do this. People, if your listeners know this, this is an exercise you do in marketing. Is you maybe come up with one, maybe two, at worst three ideal customer personas, and you talk about who they are, what do they care about, what's their mindset, and what does that lead them to becoming a customer for you, and then what resonates with them. Why do you speak to them in a certain way? Do you speak in a kind of joker like tone of voice, and that's what resonates with those people, or are you trying to be a sort of fatherly figure that educates those users? And you have to choose. You can't speak to everybody, and that's the same for sports people, athletes. You have to sort of not try to please everyone, unless you are literally like a Messi level of performance where there's a whole bunch of sort of protection moat around you, and you can just be marketed, and just putting your face there does the job on its own. But even then, I think you probably could do better if you actually tapped into that customer persona or that fan persona better.
The more you said that even made me think about my own journey, because I think about what I do now and the space I'm in and how I do what I do. I spent time getting better at presenting myself, branding, and building business and building my own sort of personal, I guess, brand, if you can call it that. But one thing I know for sure, the reason I talk the way I talk, the way I am, is because when I was growing up and as I was getting into sport, I had this one goal, which was not only to do well in my sport, but it was, from a personal level, it was to be a role model. So I was like, okay, well, what does that role model actually say, do, think? in order to, if I had 15-year-old Lewis sitting in front of me, how do I make him proud? How do I inspire him? How do I make him feel like he can? All those sorts of things. And then that became a really easy guide as to whatever I say, whatever I do, ultimately sings to now one of my number one values, which is try to leave people in a better place than how you found them. And that makes it, again, really, really simple into how I'm talking. So it hasn't got to be, I think even just from a beginner point of view, if someone's thinking, well, how do I bring this out to life right now? I haven't got anything to hold on to. It could just be based on a very simple value or a simple premise of what you want to be proud of moving forward before you start to think of strategies, frameworks, and how do I
well, that's your North Star metric. In business, we'd use that. We'd call that your North Star. Right. And, a lot of this sounds really fluffy when you first hear it. It feels like you're sort of talking about this weird nonsense that doesn't really matter. And as you can hear, I'm sort of a Mancunian from the north of England. I'm very sort of kind of this salt of the earth background. And when I started building my first businesses and I'd get branding strategists and experts talking to me about all these things, I was thinking, this is just nonsense, surely. But actually, as I built businesses now, and certainly even I've faced this recently in my most recent business, Stride, is like how to talk about it. And you've actually got to figure out what is this one thing that guides us. And even though ultimately you're trying to make a commercial success that sells products and people will buy those products and you'll make a profit from them, in order to do that well, you need to have identified this kind of soft, fluffier thing of like, what is your North Star that guides you? What is this metric that actually you care about? And what is the mission you're on? And it sounds so cringy, like businesses, or we're on a mission to do this. But you have to figure out something like that, because then everything else falls into place. So if you're saying, well, I've got this business, and this is actually what I've been going through over in the last 2 weeks, actually specifically for Stride, which is like, we're on a mission to help people optimize their health, to go from normal to optimal health. And you sort of, it sounds a little bit vague, but then when you drill down to it, it helps you understand, okay, so we're not looking for people that are unwell, we're not necessarily just thinking, or we look for people that are already really well, but they just want to tweak stuff. Like, no, and it helps sort of things fall into place. And after that, you can the frameworks almost write themselves, or these strategies write themselves. So you find out, what is this North Star metric I'm trying to be? I don't know how to directly translate that into like a young person that's just trying to figure out who they are. But like, you have to have some type of purpose, something that you really care about. If you look back on your life in 30 years and you said, like, how is the one way people would describe you? Like, that's probably going to get you somewhere to say, like, that is my North Star. And I think if I'm back to my sports career, did I really ever think my North Star was absolutely being the best 400-meter runner in the world? Probably not. It was probably something a bit more vague than being the gold medalist. That it was probably being like good enough, but being known for like these other factors around being good at that sport. Rather than that, and maybe that's why I never won. But that's also who I was.
Tell us about Stride. I'm curious to know more about Stride, actually, the mechanics of what it does and how you're trying to optimize health.
Well, probably worth framing that with a little bit of what I've done in business sort of after my sort of sporting careers. As my track and field career came to an end, I kind of fell into a serendipitous turn of events, which led to me co-founding a business called DNA Fit, which was a health tech business that pioneered the use of a DNA test, or a home genetics analysis that could look at genetic factors that affected non-medical health and wellness traits. So how your genetics might affect your response to exercise and nutrition, for example. And that business went quite well. And we built that business up from nothing and were acquired 5 years later by a bigger health tech company called Prenetics, at which point I joined that company as chief product officer. And that basically means responsible for what the user interacts with. So like when they get these health tests, or interact with a laboratory, or get some other sort of high-end supplements, that you figure out how to package that into a user experience, into an app, into a digital product, how to talk about it on the website, etc. After having some good success with that business, and actually an IPO on the Nasdaq stock exchange in the US in 2022, I took some time off, and then eventually got a little bit sort of itchy feet and wanted to do something more, and founded Stride. So we're what we call a health optimization company. And health optimization is like this science and data-backed evolution of wellness. Wellness has become a very sort of broad, squishy topic. It could involve like yoga with dogs, and skincare regimes, and walking on a beach is wellness, right? We're a little bit level above that, but we're a level below kind of longevity biohacking stuff. So we have a range of home diagnostic tests, so tests that you can take to understand your genomic profile, your microbiome, your gut health, and some blood tests, and then in the future some more what we call multi-omics, so different things looking at longitudinal stress hormone and cortisol, oral health, etc. And we use that to inform like two next steps. One is we've got a very high-end supplement which is based off your lab test results and your lifestyle and your goals, and then we've got these sort of curated human expertise packages. So we've got functional health practitioners, dietitians, exercise physiologists, and even the medical aspect of that normally for like conditions that are adjacent to nutrition and exercise, what we call cardiometabolic conditions. So basically, we've got a series of tools and products that help people sort of up their health game, whatever stage they're at. So you can understand more about your body and track it and improve.
Do you go into the sports space with that in the performance arenas?
Early days, and not focusing on that for now, like very much at this sort of consumer end, but there's obviously a role for this in sport, right, in high performance. The funny thing is, what's happened in society is everyday people are tracking like more niche biomarkers than sports people nowadays, like people are wearing a Whoop band and tracking their heart rate variability and their sleep stages and all these sort of niche metrics. And yes, sports people might be doing that too, but that used to be the realm of like very elite performance, and now it's like ubiquitous. And it's really interesting. One of the biggest podcasts in the world is the Huberman Lab, and it's like 3-hour deep dives into very, very niche like health protocols, right? And that's become pop culture, and I think it's a fascinating societal trend, one of which like I'm very happy to see, because I think it'll have really strong like downstream effects on population health. Especially the fact that young people show off about how many workouts they did at the weekend now instead of how drunk they got. And I think that's going to have a really positive effect on society in decades to come. So we sort of sit at that overlap. But yes, there is a role for this type of testing in sport. A lot of it is already happening, but it kind of happens in a fragmented way. Like one provider does one type of test, another provider is another, a different provider makes the supplement, a different practitioner has to figure out how that all knits together. We're trying to bring this into one ecosystem that's kind of interoperable and makes sense from a simple point of view.
I've always thought that with this societal shift of young people that are not going out drinking and doing as much of that on a larger scale and moving towards more health-based activities. I just had this vision of everyone sort of hustled around a table just cheersing their athletic greens and just... And it being this, right, how can we best optimize ourselves for that, and sleep masks on and getting all the red light glasses on as quickly as they can. But I don't know, there's a balance to be had, especially in the performance spaces, because there's the over optimization of everything can become almost a maladaptive behavior sometimes that can make you miss many opportunities and stones that need to be turned over that make you better in sport, because like you said, there are a lot of high performing athletes that just do some very maladaptive behaviors, like unhealthy habits, right? So, and I think there's definitely a conversation to be had about maximizing rather than optimizing, but I think from the general population,
if you
it's
took
just
it etymologically, like if you're over optimizing, it's no longer optimizing because it's not optimal. So like that's probably the point. Like the word optimal should, it's not used in that way, but it should in theory mean that at the right level, not past that and not below that, right? And now what I do hope for this sort of trend of young people moving away from alcohol-based social interaction is that they still have the social element to this interaction no matter what. And that's very important. If you look at longevity, you look at communities that have strong, healthy lives, the thing that wins over everything else, whether it's healthy diet or working hours, etc., is strong social connection. That's the thing which will make you live a long and satisfied life above others. And the very interesting point is like there's what we call a Dunning-Kruger effect in I don't know if people call it that, but it's like people go, oh, yeah, be healthy and don't drink and do all these things, and then probably it might go too far and not these, and you need to find this middle ground. And it's interesting to see the sort of proliferation of these run clubs and in real life experiences, even if they're facilitated by online experiences, resulting thing. that would be it's a nice thread to follow, and hopefully on a societal level you have this balance where, of course, you're not being orthodoxy around your workouts and your food, etc., and you have a healthy relationship with that, and you still have in-person social connections that are very strong, because that's going to lead to the true optimal. And the very fact is, optimal is a range. You reach optimal, you can go past it either way, right? You can be before it and you can be after it. And sports people at elite sport are past optimal. They're often like, too far that way, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think I've been I've fallen foul of that, where I've tried to get really dialed into everything, and then you just kind of become so pedantic about everything, and then it just drives you insane.
Yeah, and then it doesn't serve the purpose you were trying to do it for anyway, right? In that point,
no, that's and you're totally right.
The sport-life balance is so important, right? Yeah.
And with the social side, you like, I was out in Lisbon a few weeks ago. Like, you can't help but feel that from countries like that. Spain would be the same, where they really put a price on being outside, interacting with each other, being sociable. Just even like in Lisbon, the kiosks that are just everywhere, where you can just stop, have good, or it looks like fast food, but it's not. It's been kind of home cooked, and it's been made in a kitchen that's been good from good foods. Just the food in general feels more vibrant, and then the experience is more vibrant, and then you can't help but feel healthier in that. But it's probably a lot to be said about the economics.
I've got my wife's side of the family are Spanish, right? And I think the Spanish may top the league tables a long years lived now on average age, and they're up there anyway. And ostensibly, they don't live that healthy, right? They definitely drink alcohol regularly. Definitely like eat sweet things quite regularly. A sweet thing for breakfast, whatever, a sweet and little snack in the afternoon. You have this like a daily ritual of that. But the thing is, they are always out and interacting with each other. So right or wrong, they're always out, and they're up very late. And so, like, there's a lot of things on paper which shouldn't be good for your health. Like, they probably don't get as many hours of sleep as they should, and they probably drink more units of alcohol than they should. They probably have too many short-term glucose spikes compared to like the literature, how that would look. But overcoming all that is this sort of strength of social connection. And they'd probably be quite overbearing in some ways, but it absolutely is like a massive contributor. And it's just a funny thing to think about. I don't know who, exactly who your listeners are and what stage of life, but like, no matter what you do, it's probably worthwhile, like, keeping that present in your head to think, like, in all these other things I'm trying to do for what I'm trying to achieve, like, how can I also keep like friendships and family connections and in-person like social like connections present too, to have this intangible benefit, but downstream. It's a very, very hard thing to do, right? You think about, I'm focused on this work goal or focused on this sporting goal. You probably still need to make time for that somehow in order to reach that goal better.
Definitely. Andrew, where's the best place for people to follow along with yourself, get into more detail around Stride? Where do you want to send people? Where's the best place for them to go?
Probably first point of call is just find me on Instagram, just at Andrew Steele, spelled Steele at the end of Steele. But yeah, Andrew Steele is my username Instagram. Find me there. If you want to check out Stride, we're at www.getstride.com. But follow me on Instagram, and you'll find signposts to the various things I do outside of that.
Mate, I appreciate you so much. The stuff that you're doing, the insights you give, the way you talk about it, it's always a breath of fresh air to have you on and be talking to you. So, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on.
Really glad to be a fascinating conversation as always, Lewis.
Andrew Steele, thank you so much.
Cheers, man.
If you've enjoyed that episode with Andrew, you might enjoy even more episodes of the show. And we put together a playlist of some of the best episodes to get started with right away. All you got to do is head right here. Go on, go.